What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hetmas, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Amanda Cookson, and we speak about the neuroscience of communication and how we can turn situations and conversations that spark cortisol and make us stressed and reduce intelligence of teams and groups to conversations and communication that spark oxytocin and hence increase creativity and capacity of those around us, those we lead. And I really invite you to stick around until the end, because in the last 20 minutes, we get personal and really dig deep into the difference between a growth and a fixed mindset and how Amanda has shifted and what she has learned from her experience as a corporate leader and is now teaching it and helping other leaders as a coach. So stick around until the end and don't forget to scroll down to the show notes to click on all the additional resources we collected there for you. Enjoy the conversation. Thank you for listening. Hello, Amanda. Welcome to the show.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
I'm very much looking forward to this conversation about communication and neuroscience and leadership and all my favorite topics. So yeah, welcome.
Thank you.
And I always start at the beginning. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
I do actually call myself a facilitator. And I think the first time was after qualifying as a coach and running coach-like training or workshops. And I was thinking, I'm not imparting information. I am asking questions. I'm sparking learning. I'm sparking change. And what is this? It's actually facilitating. So that's when I first started calling myself a facilitator. And actually by doing it, I think it helped me release my ego expert and let me tell you 1,000 things I know about this topic and sort of create more experiences and get more of a sense of that magical space that you get within coaching, which then facilitates that change.
Yeah, totally. And when you just said, let me tell you the million things I know. I mean, I can relate so much to that. And I think everyone who has been in the training or education space and then primed by what we're going to talk about, the neuroscience, also think cognitively we know that just giving more content and telling everyone everything we know doesn't help them absorb it. And then the facilitation bit is also, okay, being aware of that. What is really the information they know and what is the information they need?
Yeah, and I think there's also, because I love to refer to neuroscience to understand how the brain works to then improve my practice. And so what I learned when studying the neuroscience of change is that in order to facilitate change in somebody, they need to have some uncomfortableness. So there needs to be what I think I know and what I now know. And so if you're trying to help people move into that space of different thinking, you can't tell them everything. And often you need to create a teeny bit of discomfort so they can work out and bridge the gap for themselves. So that facilitation is also, I think, really key, because when we first started doing these kind of coach-like activities, sometimes the gap would be too big. Sometimes the discomfort would be too great. And so it's just making sure that it's just enough for change and that penny to drop, that what I've been doing before maybe could be better, and I might want to try thinking or working in this different space.
So that basically they're intrinsically motivated instead of extrinsically pushed towards change.
Yeah. But I think there's also something in your brain that when you're given a piece of information, it fires up an entirely different part of the brain than when you're bridging this gap. And actually another way of thinking about bridging that gap is creating an aha moment or an insight. And that insight is where you start to connect things you've not connected before. Or it can be where you create cognitive dissonance. So I don't know whether this is a phrase that's going to be familiar with people, but my way of thinking about cognitive dissonance is I used to think I was awesome at this. And now I've got this information and it's challenged my perception of self. And it's made me think, oh, perhaps this problem I may have created, perhaps this suboptimal way of doing things, I might have done a bit of that. And I don't want to be that person. So I'm going to need to lean into this space. It's that kind of discomfort.
Yeah, beautiful. How did you get into the world of neuroscience?
Oh, it's a ridiculous story, and I'm embarrassed to share it. But you asked me the question, so I'm going to share it. So I was training as a coach with this amazing company called Barefoot Training, and they bring in different people, different tutors, different areas. So their coaching philosophy is, beware of the person with one book. Because if you've only got one book, you've got that inflexibility. So they've got all this breadth of people. So this guy came in and he wasn't announced. We didn't know who he was. I wasn't expecting him. He didn't have any notes. So I had my folder there. And I was like, who is this guy? And why hasn't he got any notes? And he delivered his training in this very scant way. So we had to do an awful lot of work to try and work out what was he saying? What did he mean by that? How does this relate to this? And it really activated me. So I could feel myself getting hot and, cross. And I was thinking about how much money I'd invested and the time away. And, I was really getting myself in a bit of a tiz. And then he asked the question, okay, so who's finding this a little bit challenging? And I was like, me, what are you doing? And then he explained about the brain, and he used, I think it's Steve Peters' chimp paradox as a way of illustrating that you've got the monkey mind and the computer, and what's the other one? Is it a filing cabinet or the human? That's it. These three bits. And so what he was doing was just activating our monkeys and saying whose monkey was, whose chimp was going, let's go on. What's going on? So he then went on and he explained parts of the coaching process and how that might activate monkeys and, which bit was computers and which bit was the human. So I then went on, read the book, and then started to research other bits of neuroscience and came across David Rock and his SCARF model. And I'd, prior to going into coaching, had been running a department around customer experience, and the department had closed, and I'd found that really difficult. And in the process of it closing and going through a merger, my performance and my attitude and just everything wasn't where it normally was, and I'd really struggled. And so I now had a model to understand my behavior, a way of thinking about my best and my worst behavior and what was going on in the brain. And then I was able to start seeing that in my clients. And so I work mostly with technical experts who've then moved into leadership. So quite often you become a nerd in your area and you get promoted because you're really good at that bit. And then you're given a human, and it just doesn't seem to work quite as well because humans are so confusing. So I started giving clients more understanding about the brain very simplistically, first of all using the chimp paradox, and then in a more sophisticated way using the stuff from the Neuro Leadership Institute. And I found the more I leaned into it and the more I shared, the more helpful it was, particularly for technical experts, of which I guess I was one, to just understand the complexity not only of themselves and their feeling, but also to decode what goes on with other people.
Yeah. Can you remind us of what the chimp paradox is?
Oh, so the chimp paradox was Steve Peters' book. I've got it somewhere on a shelf, and if he's listening to this, he'll go, "You're explaining that very badly, Amanda." Oh, here it is. Look, I love a bit of a prompt. So here it is. I'm going to flash the book because it's a really good first starter, I think, into neuroscience. So basically, he explains the parts of your brain in three bits. So your primitive brain, he calls your chimp brain. And this is the bit of your brain that responds emotionally and reacts to what's going on around you. Then your computer is your limbic system and your memories, everything that's ever been stored. And then you've got your human, which is like little you trying to go about, do things. So he explains these 3 parts of the brain and how they react and how quickly the chimp responds and gets upset, and just how the whole process of how we rationalize what's going on works in this little sequence where the chimp goes, what's going on? And then the brain looks to the computer and says, how do we feel about this? What's happened to us before in the past? And the poor little humans trying to work out in between about what do I do and how do I react to people? So that's that one in a nutshell. And I think it's probably a very thin description of it, because I've then moved on. And one of my favorite models I now use comes from Dr. Dan Siegel. You see, I told you I was a bit of a nerd, so I've switched customer experience with neuroscience. So Dan Siegel has done loads of stuff around children, and he's got a book called Mindsight, and he talks about the handy model of the brain. He's got books for parents, which is like the whole brain child. And so what he does, and I think for me, it's an even better model than the one that Professor Steve Peters offers, is that, so if you imagine my hand is your brain, so this is the whole of your brain, my nice relaxed, I'm having a lovely time talking to your brain. So this is my brain stem. So this is like swallowing, temperature control.
Pointing at your wrist.
Exactly. Then here.
It's a podcast, so some people might not see your
Oh, yes, of course.
video.
I was thinking about the video. So in your brain, then going down from the back of your head, down your spine is your brain stem. And that's where you have kind of swallowing, temperature control, and all the rest of it. And if you make a fist with your hand, then that represents your wrist going down your arm. So then inside your brain, so the interior of your brain, is something called your limbic system. So if you open up your palm and look at your hand, it's kind of represented there. And that's where your emotions and memory and sort of feeling is stored. But it's also your kind of habitual thinking. So then if you curl your fingers round back into a fist, all around the outside of your palm and now your fingers, that is your cortex. So that is kind of the outside of your brain from the back to the front. And your cortex does things like emotional regulation, self-awareness, self-management, and sort of socially acceptable kind of behavior. So it's sort of stopping me from, shouting out pumpkin as my 13-year-old daughter would do, at the moment, because that's not helpful. And then if this is a sad bit for me, so your forehead and represented by fingernails, if you're kind of looking at your fist as a handy model of the brain, that represents your prefrontal cortex. So this is the most modern part of your brain, or the human part of the brain in Steve Peters' model. And this is where we do planning, creative thinking, collaborative work. All of our higher order thinking happens there. So what the chimp model was talking about, and what I think Dan Siegel's model does brilliantly, is it explains that when you're triggered or flipped or activated, or whatever word you want to use, or challenged, your brain floods with cortisol. And the cortisol is there to start moving, against a threat, get you ready, get you prepared, to protect you, to keep you safe. So when cortisol hits your brain, it shuts off access to your prefrontal cortex. So Dan Siegel talks about this as being flipping your lid. So essentially in your brain, you've got these 2 little almond-shaped clusters, and they're called your amygdala. And your amygdala is your kind of warning system. So I don't know, if I started singing, my singing is awful, your amygdala would instantly be activated, and you'd be like, oh my gosh, I thought we were having a conversation about neuroscience, and now this woman's singing. This is very strange. What do I do? Or when you're kind of walking along and there's a bang and you're really startled, or you think you see something out the corner of your eye and you're not sure what it is, or
any surprise or unexpected incident.
Yeah. But also I think in conversations where someone might say, I think that's rubbish, I don't agree with you, or can you explain this for me?
So it's a stress. It's a stress response.
Exactly. Anything that gives you a stress response or makes you feel like you're being judged or criticized, or whatever is activating for you, your amygdala is alerted. It then looks to your limbic system, which is the kind of bit on the inside of your hand, and it says, how do we feel about this kind of scenario? And our limbic system will say, really bad, we hate it, it's awful. And so your brain carries on flooding with cortisol and it shuts off access to your prefrontal cortex. So you drop 15 IQ points. That's a bit depressing. 50% less creative, unable to work collaboratively because you don't want to share, you don't want to work with others. You become more mistrustful. Your negativity bias has increased. And go into this protection mode. And so, a very long explanation, but the thread I'm coming back to is, why am I so into this stuff? Because when I was leading a team and I was in my element, absolutely brilliant. When I was facilitating events and activities, marvelous. It was like genius was being channeled from the universe. As soon as I got under threat, I couldn't remember anything. I was tongue-tied. I'd go sweaty. I'd get really upset. I'd take things personally. And I was like, oh, there's something wrong with me. I'm clearly not cut out for this. Other people don't seem to be struggling. What's going on with me? And this model helped me realize there's absolutely nothing wrong with me. I'm having a human reaction. And actually, by understanding what your brain does, you can then work with your brain to talk yourself down from a ledge and stay in that whole brain space.
And so you're speaking from your experience when you were running a department. So you were still in your corporate life.
Yes.
And I recognize that a lot. So not only when in my previous life, when I was still in a day job and running a team through a very difficult time. And even now as an entrepreneur working with my team, I had a difficult moment. And I'm aware of all of that. And I think this is where then the difficulty comes in, the knowing doing gap. So I'm very aware of everything that's happening, that, I'm barking at an email basically as if it was a tiger.
Yep.
And I'm turning into the worst version of myself.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we get from the conscious incompetent to the conscious competent? So how can team leaders or facilitators, how can humans go from the realization to then the acting? Or is it all about communication, actually, and to be honest about it?
Well, I think it starts with yourself, which will be, it actually is very unpopular because we love to blame other people. It's all them. If only they weren't like this, I'd be fine. But it starts with yourself. And in the model, this handy model of the brain by Dan Siegel, what he says is that if you understand the way your brain works, you can work with your brain to talk yourself down. So essentially, whenever something happens, your amygdala gets activated, senses a threat, will talk to your limbic system and say, how do we feel about this? And instead of saying, oh my goodness, I hate this, that person is an idiot, they're doing it again, or this is all going to go wrong, we talk kindly to ourselves and we talk ourselves down. So we might say, I'm just feeling a bit triggered because when people ask me questions, it activates my inner imposter syndrome. But this question is because they're curious, not because they are questioning my worth. So it might be something like that, or whatever it is that's relevant to you. And so instead of fully flipping your lid, you can keep yourself in that whole brain state. Because when you're in that whole brain state, you can then be more creative, you can work more collaboratively. So I think there's that. And then I think the other thing is you need to have a better understanding of what it means to be human. And so all humans get triggered. All humans use survival strategies when under threat. So all humans, when they are feeling uncomfortable, whether that's because the thing that you're facilitating is making them question the way that they've done things before, or because the piece of work that you're giving someone is a bit more tricky than they used to, or because you've asked someone a question and they're a reflective thinker and their brain's gone blank for a bit. Whatever it is, the behavior you're getting is just a natural human response. And it's about that person and them processing how they feel. It's not about you.
Yeah. And I think normalizing that we all have imposter syndrome. we all feel that we are not good enough, that we don't know enough. And I think especially nowadays with AI, as weird as it sounds, I have the impression that we are constantly reminded of everything we don't know.
Interesting.
And overly rely, and maybe even, and I'm just thinking out loud, because the more we get used to, and I can speak about myself, the more I get used to collaborating with AI, with ChatGPT. I love using ChatGPT as a sparring partner and asking it prompts and then getting stuff back. But I can almost realize how I get dependent on that and then start questioning what I know. And then I realize everything that I don't know. So I wonder whether the speed of things and the availability of knowledge is actually increasing this process of us feeling not good enough. And especially when we are specialists in our field, where we have a higher tendency, I think, for imposter syndrome.
Well, yes, feeling like you don't know enough or becoming an expert is one type of or one driver around that imposter syndrome space. And I think it's interesting because, as you were saying, well, ChatGPT shows me what I don't know. I think what ChatGPT has taught me, because I think there's our experience of reality and then there's reality, is the power of a great question.
Yes.
So it's not actually about what ChatGPT knows, because information isn't useful unless it's relevant.
100%.
The real wisdom comes from asking a great question. And I think one of the things that I've learned, as I've improved in my facilitation, is that it's not about what I know. It's about what I ask. And it's about the thinking that is sparked. And there is something about, I think the more expertise you have, the more it feels like every single thing in that is relevant.
Yeah.
And it really isn't, because for a lot of people, all they need is this one single piece, this one piece that will spark the insight and spark the change. And as I was kind of saying earlier, the bit of your brain that loves to know information and data and collect stuff is not the part of your brain that has insight. So you're not even stretching into the right space. So getting ChatGPT to, brain spew, tell me everything about X, that's never going to give you anything really helpful. I think the benefit is actually in your own interrogation of the information and your insert, your concepts. I love ChatGPT, and I've given ChatGPT a very, very, I think it's like 15-page detail of my ideal client. So I've got ADHD tendencies, so my brain will go off on 75 tangents. You probably experienced that already. In this half an hour, where's she going now? And so what I get ChatGPT to do is just remind me, I know, Amanda, that everything in the world is so fascinating, but this is the person that you're talking to, and this is what they care about. And it just brings me back and reminds me, because that little bit is really hard for my brain.
Yeah. And this is that's the piece that I meant, that we get so used to ChatGPT and rely on the condensation of information. And I totally agree that it is about the prompt and what are we looking for. And then I think it's where I think as facilitators, we've known that already. And you mentioned that getting to a point that it's not about what you know, but how can you help the group to find their own insights. And then I think as soon as we were the head of a trainer, I think that's where it becomes difficult, because we're somehow paid to get into a room to train people. Although if it was really about the knowledge transfer, they can go online and get better information. So it's not about the knowledge transfer. It is about the experience. And it actually is about creating the spark, but then how to get a group to really lean into the discomfort be open for the spark and also be open to do the work.
Yes.
Because it is more difficult for them to actually do the thinking themselves instead of leaning back and absorbing, sponging the content while maybe replying to a few emails.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I feel the best thing to do there is to set your ground rules. So when I first came across the technique of setting ground rules, it just kind of felt like this is a bit dull. You know, if you're busy, you don't need to do it. There's like a hygiene thing, you know, like if there's a fire alarm, we'll go out this door here. But do you really need to bother? And I think that for me, the ground rules set the tone for how I want everyone to behave and be. And I've learned over the years to set ground rules about how it feels. So I have 3 things that whenever I'm working with a group are always in and always shared, and that's my contribution. And then I get people to add to it. So the first one is presence, which means that, you know, we've got the time blocked in our diary, we've got nowhere else to go. And just for, you know, however long it is, let's be present. And what that means is it gives people a more gentle way to put the phone away, you know, put away your distractions and just be present, because we're only here for the day or an hour or, you know, whatever it is. So that's my first one. Then my second one is curiosity, because when you are curious and you're thinking, how is this relevant to me? What can I take away from this for me? Instead of people sat there thinking, I know all this already, or I don't like this, or I don't know why I'm here, you've instantly got people tapping into the bit of their brain where they're thinking, well, what could I take away from today? How could this be helpful for me? So it kind of reframes that element of it. And then my third one is generosity. And generosity is in sharing your questions, sharing your thoughts, and highlighting the experience we create together. Because being in a room at this moment in time is co-created by everyone in the room. It's a completely unique experience, and it's never going to happen again. And if we share with generosity our questions, our thoughts, our ideas, then it makes what we're doing so much more fun and interesting. But also, because we all think differently, that question or that observation may be just the thing that someone else needs to hear. So we're all a part of each other's learning. And that, for me, I think shifts some of the attitude and energy in the room and creates a more successful, I guess, gathering of people.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds as if it also grounds everyone to how do we want to show up in the space for the next X minutes or hours. And I've once read it over again also in more technical literature. So I assume that it's right and not just an urban legend, that we cannot be curious and angry, upset, sad at the same time. So apparently these are, again, opposing regions in the brain. So if we can access our curiosity, and if we can remind the group to be curious, we can also calm down all the rest of their nervous system and big emotions.
Yeah. And one of the bits of training that I did after I qualified as a coach was in conversation intelligence. And so what that talked about was certain behaviors that would spike cortisol and create brains to flip, or would elevate oxytocin and create connection. So being in that space of curiosity, appreciation, discovery, co-creation, development creates more oxytocin than being in a kind of a more kind of judging, dictating, knowing space. So it also, for me, is about trying to create and co-create the conversations that you want to have that are going to be more positive, more connecting, more collaborative, and sort of setting out the frame, I guess, and the way in which people need to be as human beings in order to achieve that.
Yeah, I would do that. And I love it, the kind of cortisol-inducing conversations versus the oxytocin-inducing conversations. And I think once we are aware of that, as not only as facilitators, but in general, the better we can steer, especially those difficult conversations and potentially conflict.
Yeah.
What are maybe phrases that might either trigger the cortisol reaction? And how would you reframe them to be more on the oxytocin side?
Oh, interesting. Well, I think anything that feels like a criticism or anything where people are judged, either judging themselves, I can't do this, or who are you to tell me this? That sort of judgment. Those are things that are very cortisol inducing. And I think when people are maybe questioning themselves, it's then reframing that into, well, what can you do? What makes sense? Who else has solved this? How can we work together? Yeah, this is really tricky. So you're doing those sorts of things to normalize that and make people feel comfortable. And then for me, it's quite a lot of self-talk about the reason why the person is asking me that question is not about me. It's because they're finding this, threatening or confusing. And so I tend to, if I've been asked a question that's landed, I guess, badly on me, I might then ask them, can you just rephrase that so I can understand where you need the help? Or I might do, well, let's have a stop and look at this. So I used to, when I was asked something or when something felt really difficult, kind of avoid it. Whereas I found actually if you lean into it in this space of generous curiosity, oh, interesting, okay, so you're really stuck on this and it doesn't make sense. Let's unpick that. Let's have a look. Is anyone else stuck? Has anyone solved it? So you're utilizing what's there and you're taking yourself and any self-doubt or judgment out of it, because as soon as you become triggered as the facilitator or leader or that central point, all of your communication will be barbed and spiky, even if you don't realize you're doing it consciously, and will then elevate cortisol in others, even if you don't intend it. So one little thing here that you may have taken out of context that's then wobbled you can mean you then create this sort of sense of distrust or confusion in others.
So it's basically contagious.
Yeah, hugely.
Yeah. I was just thinking back of rephrase. I found this on LinkedIn at some point. Maybe that's an example of how to get from cortisol to oxytocin. The question, how creative are you? Which is, now I have to measure and I have to explain how creative I am, into how are you creative? Which basically assumes that you're creative and is just asking curiously about an example, which can be playing with my kids or scribbling while being on the phone, up to a real creative hobby or problem solving.
You could also take the personal out of it and look at it from what are signs of creativity, or what do creative people do, or how would you define, view creativity? So you've then got a sense of something that's, instead of that judgment of self, you're looking at something sort of outside of self. And then you can ask the question, how are you creative? What elements of that do you do?
Basically to create a little bit of a landing or a set of resources for them to feel inspired to then answer the question, so that they are not confronted immediately.
Yes, because
Context.
When somebody's thinking more freely about, let's say, creativity, they've got space to come up with ideas. And even if there's nothing in there that they think they do, they actually have been creative in creating the list of what is creativity. So I think it gives people a broader opportunity to win and be successful, because for some people, when you ask them a question about themselves, their distortion, so their inner chimp, is so noisy that they will struggle to see they are within that. Whereas these are just other little ways to help brains feel more comfortable.
Yeah. And it reminds me of the situation when we come out of a flu. So while we are sick, and I assume that it's like this for everyone, for me, I have the impression that it will never be good again. And how could I ever have the energy to think or to do something? I just feel miserable. And then suddenly from one day to the other, I feel like reborn and I see clearly and I have energy and I start cleaning my house and myself and cooking. And I think it's similar to when we come out of such a stress response, where we are narrow-minded, we only see the problems, we only see the negative, we're extremely pessimistic, everyone is our enemy. And once our nervous system calms down, we see possibility and creativity and solutions. And
I find, because I coach quite a lot of leaders, to understand their brain, to communicate effectively, and sometimes they divide the world or their stakeholders or their team sometimes. Sometimes it's their senior leadership colleagues into kind of like allies and enemies. So you've got these kind of friends and foes, and they're completely different. So with the people that they feel are aligned to my values, they understand the agenda in which I need to work and deliver, they're on board, they're good eggs, I'm this person. And then with this lot who don't get it, who always say no, who are really difficult, really challenging, I'm an entirely different person. And so what I try and get them to understand is that actually part of the response you get is the mindset in which you're in. So it's not just about, as you describe beautifully, that I'm free of the flu, I'm full of energy. It's also getting yourself into the point where you might be going into what makes you feel like you have the flu. I don't know, talking to the finance director or the sales team or whatever, and actually letting go of that and thinking about them as, what do we have in common? How can we work together towards common goals? How can I approach the things that they are saying with curiosity? How can I bring my whole brain self into this conversation and lean in to the questions they ask rather than bring up my defenses? Because if you change your energy with somebody, they will change theirs. And so it's not that this group of people are lovely and this group of people are terrible. It's more that the way you feel and are and the way your brain is functioning with one group gives them one version of you, and the way you are with another gives them another.
And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It does.
So if I encounter a person and I think they're my enemy, then my smile will be fake and they will see it. So they will, we talked about that in our exploration call, that if we are hiding parts of ourselves, they will recognize it immediately and then think that we are not trustworthy. So if I'm faking a smile because I know, I'm a team leader, I don't like you, I think you're against me, you're my enemy, but I will pretend that I like you. Yeah. And then you will think, she's fake. Something is wrong.
Like me. Yeah, she doesn't like me. There's something off. I don't believe what she's saying. I don't want to share this piece of information. I'm going to be guarded with you because I perceive you as being guarded with me. So you create an entirely different sense of connection and relationship.
Yeah. And I think this is so important because when I train team leaders on conflict resolution, I find it very interesting that most are looking for this 3-step solution and the model that will help you solve all the conflicts. And I always start with, let's look at being human and what does it mean? And most of the conflict actually originate from these kind of things, that we have a preconception about someone or we feel insecure and we make this big thing out of it and then it becomes the thing because at the end it's never about the socks.
Yeah. And I think we look for evidence to support our view. So once we've decided something about someone, we will constantly be looking for, yes, they do dislike me, they don't agree with my policy or principles, they aren't good at leadership, whatever it is, we're looking for evidence to support it. And you can take an awful lot of what we do as human beings is ambiguous, isn't it? You can take it two ways, and rather than being generous with our interpretation, we've decided, so we are judging, limiting, withholding information, and doing, again, all those things that will elevate cortisol and create really poor conversations.
And I assume that let's assume that we are not psychopaths and not masochistic. This means that we don't want to be in this cortisol state. We don't want to see everyone as our enemies. And still, we do. So, at least in some parts, and I think when I look around me, many of those who work in corporate, that's their daily routine.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we, even as facilitators, when we engage with such a group, how can we help them, or how can they help themselves? Why is it that we are making ourselves so miserable?
I think that our human brain is wired to keep us safe. So I read somewhere 5 times every second, your brain is looking, am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? And so people's, I guess, language that they use, the social cues that they give, the way that we feel inside the group, that all registers as social pain, and social pain is again felt in the brain in the same spaces as physical pain. So being excluded from a meeting, or asking for feedback and only getting criticism, or learning that your email has been forwarded on to someone else that you weren't expecting, all these things are pains that we experience as though we've been, wounded mortally, and anything that makes us feel like our standing in the group is threatened. So we may be seen as being less than, in terms of less valuable, less clever, less able, again, is felt as a threat to life. Because our brains, the monkey brain that we've got, is very primitive, and it's kind of going back to the time where if we were excluded from the tribe, then we had no shelter, we had no food, we were in a terrible space. So it's part of our innate human nature to keep ourselves safe and to be very wary of our standing in the group. And within the corporate world, there are lots of groups and lots of standing and lots of hierarchy and lots of pressure and lots of threat, but people don't realize that. So I think the first thing is about your own self-regulation and your own way of understanding yourself, understanding what's going on in others, and taking that personal out of it. And there was a piece of research that was done, I think, by Escada, which is a Spanish business school. And they were looking at what makes for the most successful leaders. And it was all about the leaders that were able to self-regulate and self-modulate their behavior, so stay calm, and even were the ones that were most able to collaborate, most able to problem solve. Because again, every time you get flipped, you're dropping up to 15 IQ points. You're 50% less creative, which means you can't solve problems. You're reactive. Your perception, as you mentioned before, narrows. So you're very, very kind of single focused. You make a lot more errors. You just don't see things that are in front of you. You're unable to communicate in a way that engages others. And you may get really fixated in giving people a good telling to, and over explaining and arguing, in a sense, rather than listening and asking questions. So to a long-winded way of answering your question, but I think, how do you stop or reduce the amount of conflict that people might be experiencing in teams and works? And work is to work on yourself, first of all, and to really think about what triggers you, what activates you, what is it that's going on in the day that's made you feel like this? How else could you think about it? How else could you reframe it? And then start to shape your days and your weeks in a way that you don't then react, and you can choose your response.
Yeah. 2 weeks ago, I had a conversation with Juanita Robertson, and she's speaking a lot about grief and how we cannot actually really relate and connect to other people if we haven't done our grief work. And I think all of these perceived attacks are actually just that we, so we first need to feel, because often, and I see it in myself, I realize that I'm in a bad state when I'm biking through the city center of Amsterdam and I'm getting angry at tourists because they are stepping in my way. So when I'm angry at them, these poor tourists, actually means that I have to turn inward and see, okay, what needs to be felt?
Yeah.
That I'm actually producing all this anger, because it's so easy for the brain to blame the entire world for our misery.
I think it's much more comfortable, actually, to blame everyone else, to find fault, to look at the world and spot the patterns. This thing is to blame and this thing is to blame, because actually looking at yourself creates some discomfort. It creates that discomfort, because nobody wants to think, well, I'm grumpy, or I'm being difficult, or I could have been kinder. But actually, that's the best place to start.
And that's, again, the cognitive dissonance. We see ourselves as these kind people. So we think, oh, we're doing all the best. And then we don't want to see all these behaviors of ours that actually contradict our self-image.
Yeah. It's how could they do that to me? They made me feel this.
Yeah.
And it's the reality of it, which is, like, I think, a very pro ninja move, is that no one really does anything to you. You do it to yourself. You are making yourself feel that. And so, I mean, if somebody's doing something dangerous or harmful, walk away. Don't get involved anymore. Let it. You don't have to fix it. That's not your responsibility. And when somebody is difficult in a meeting, or is being argumentative, that's about them. That's not about you. And then if you can get yourself back into that whole brain state, you can start to use language that will elevate oxytocin and help you be in the best possible state to communicate. Because if you think about it, when you've been flustered and someone said something to you, often your brain is blank. And it's not until afterwards, or later, or the next morning, or your brain goes, oh, I should have said this, or I should have said that, or I could have said this, or I could have said that. So staying in your whole brain state means that those things don't happen as much.
Yeah, and I think, sorry.
No, well, the other thing I was going to say is that I think we also have a big sense of, we've been talking about imposter syndrome, and imposter syndrome at its heart is a feeling of not being enough. And so when you can sit with that understanding that you are enough, you've done enough, this is enough, then it again is much easier to take space and see other people's behavior as their behavior, their reactions, and it's not about you.
Yeah, so it all boils down, from what I hear, to creating just a little bit of calm for ourselves and everyone around us. And I'm thinking of group work, where we are almost always working against the clock because we never have enough time. And I observe it in trainers and facilitators. When there's so much to do and so little time, they speed up, and they then spark this nervousness in the entire space. And if you don't have time, then every participant has the impression that what they have to contribute is not good enough. They are making it too long. They second guess whether they shall contribute or not, which actually does the opposite of what we want to do in a group session. And then we again on what you said about how contagious our behavior is. So if we are stressed about time, we're infecting the entire group, and then they cannot think. So I came for myself to the conclusion, and that's what I usually do. The less time I have, the more I slow down. And this usually helps me to finish on time. Yeah,
well, I had decided a while ago that I wouldn't sacrifice the conversation for the agenda. The agenda is loosely held. And I tend to now, when I'm planning things, have a core of things that we must do, and then some things that we can expand into if there's time, or not if we don't. And so quite often I'm recalibrating as I'm going, because what's important, I think, for the people who come and work with me is to have an experience, is to take away some learning, some change, something they can do. And actually worrying about chucking words quickly at somebody isn't going to achieve that. So I let go of the agenda, and I'm kind of focusing in on where the conversation is. And I'm like saying to myself, doesn't matter if we don't do this bit, because actually that bit is not as important as this bit here. And then as we're going through, I can then think about, because I guess I'm lucky in the sense that the work I deliver is my work, so I know it intimately. What's the lightest touch of this? They've got a bit of it.
Yeah. Which then comes back to your first ground rule, which is presence. You have to be present with what is emerging in the group and what's needed. And I think it's so funny that many of us still believe that what is communicated is also what is heard and perceived. But actually our attention span is so short. I think if people who listen to this podcast just remember one thing, that would be great. And I guess in 60% of the cases, this one thing they remember is actually also wrong. Something that maybe we didn't say, but they heard in a different context.
Well, it'll be what sparked an insight, and it will be something that had a bit of that understanding gap where they heard of it and they thought, what does that mean with this? Oh, and their brain has then sparked them off into another tangent. There was something I did, a neuroscience of learning course, and I think it was called Training from the Back of the Room, which is all about using brain-friendly ways of learning. So in this brain-based model of learning, it talks about the importance of learning within a group rather than individually. And the reason is because, and it's that very thing that you've just mentioned, that when you ask people to reflect on, well, what have you heard, or what are you going to take away, or what's the one thing that's significant from this? When people share, it's almost like creating this really complex web of ideas and layers of understanding and things that other people, oh, I would never have thought of that, or I didn't hear that bit, oh, when I heard that, I didn't interpret it that way, I interpreted it this way. So it gives you layer upon layer upon layer of understanding that when you're learning on your own, or when you're not having those conversations, you don't get. And it's that rich layering that thickens the neural connections that you have and makes the bit of learning more sticky in your brain as well.
Yeah. And actually, we are learning so much about the other people in the room, what's relevant for them. Because to come back to what you were saying, that our brain looks for information that confirms what we already know, and for information that is actually helpful, depending on our goals and ambitions. So someone with a different worldview, a different perspective, a different goals will retain different pieces of information because that's what's relevant. Yeah, I remember I do these 10-day silent meditation Vipassana retreats. And in every retreat, there are the same recorded Dhamma talks by Gwenka there. I think an hour long, always the same talks. And I've done 5 or 6 sittings. And every time it's the same talk. And every time I remember and hear something that feels like, oh, I've never heard that before.
I have a theory about that very phenomenon. And I think it's that personal growth is like a spiral. So the first time you heard the talk and did your first silent sitting, you would have been, let's say, at level 1. So you would have heard it from this perspective. And then because you've been working on your meditation practice, you'll kind of spiral up. And when you hear it again, you hear a different level and a different level and a different level. And it just keeps going and increasing. And so you are, and this kind of spiral theory that I have is that as a human being, you are never the same person twice. Because, you last week hadn't had this conversation today. And you next week would have had more conversations, more experiences. And we're constantly growing and refining our view and honing how we feel about ourselves and what we stand for. And so as we're receiving information and experiences and data from others, we are experiencing them again at a different level of ourselves and our awareness.
Yeah, that's true. We are never the same person twice. I love that. Yeah, which makes long-term relationships so difficult. Because we actually have to spiral in the same direction.
Yeah. Also interesting, if you hold lightly what you want.
Yeah. There's one thing that I'm fascinated about at the moment, and I would love your insight, your perspective, emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Because lots of the things that we have talked about are the self-awareness. We talked about the emotions, and you have worked in corporate, led a department, and you're now working as a coach with leaders.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about emotions? And you know that I'm fascinated about the concept of professionalism, unprofessionalism these days.
Mm-hmm.
What is the role of emotions? How do you make the sense of emotions or the relevance more accessible, and maybe using your brain science background to make sense of all of that?
Yeah. Ooh, that's such a juicy question. I'm thinking, where's the best place to get started in this? So I will tell you a bit of a story. So when I first trained as a coach, so I'd come out of corporate, did my first training as a coach, and somebody was thinking about moving house, and you did a 3-way observation. So I was observed in my first coaching practice, and I thought I did a brilliant job because I got the person to think about all these practical things about what they needed to do. And the person who was observing me said, "Amanda, did you not notice how nervous they were, or when they expressed their feelings here or there, expressed their feelings there?" And I didn't see it, which was really interesting. So I literally didn't hear it, didn't notice it. My brain had decided it wasn't relevant. And I felt really uncomfortable in leaning into that space. So when I first started as a coach, the very first thing I did was business coaching. So I came out of corporate, and it's all to do with the targets and the numbers and the plans and all the rest of it. And what I learned was I had a client who was setting up a business, and literally they had every single thing they could possibly have. And it wasn't until I leant into the fact that they were hesitant, and everything they said had until, I can't do such and such until. And I had this coaching session with them around their emotions and around until, and it unblocked them, and they're running their business, and they've had their business now for 10 years. And they send me, little thank yous and all the rest of it. And so I started to realize that feelings were important, and that feelings could be part of my coaching. Mm-hmm. And I've, over the last 10 years that I've been practicing as a coach, I've been doing it more and more and more. And I think people often think that work is about logic, but human brains don't work just on that space of logic. They have feelings, they have passions, they have emotions, they have all these neurochemicals kind of bubbling around their head that affect how they listen, how they relate to others, and how they understand. And so I help leaders utilize their emotions by understanding that when they are emotionally charged, they can't do their best thinking, their brain may be flipped, they may not be able to access everything, and that the people that they are working with are also in the same state. So if we just go back to that handy model of the brain that I was sharing by Dan Siegel, if your team aren't able to access their whole brain, so they are flipped, you have got collectively a group of people who are less intelligent, less able to work together, less able to problem solve, less able to achieve things. And for an awful lot of businesses now, I think, You are solving problems that have never been solved before. You are trying to operate in an environment that's got more uncertainty than I think there's ever been. So there are a lot of things there that need, I guess, our whole brain thinking. So the best thing I think for leaders to be effective is to know what triggers them and what triggers their team, and to start working in a more brain friendly way. And to be brain friendly, you need to be emotion aware. So emotions are useful. Emotions are data. Emotions are telling you stuff. And when someone is emotional, I think what can happen is that people think, I need to fix that. I need to solve that. I need to soothe that. Or I don't want them to feel that. So I'm going to either pretend it's not there, because I think that will make them feel better, and we'll just work around it. Whereas actually emotions are there as data to explore. You seem agitated, or you don't seem yourself, or you seem a little down, or you seem very excited. Tell me more. Tell me how you feel about this. What's going on inside your head at the moment? How are you feeling about this opportunity or this situation?
Yeah.
What's making you think that? These questions mean that you don't have to become. So I had a leader the other day, and they were having a good old grumble about the world, and they were saying, the problem is now, Amanda, not only do we have to lead all of this complexity, but we need to be social workers and therapists as well. And I think, well, that's one way of looking at it. What's another way of operating? Because actually, I as a professional coach, and people share things with me that they've not shared with anyone else, I don't carry that burden. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a therapist. I'm there to help people do their best thinking and to manage their state so that they can then go on and do their best thinking.
And this distance is a beautiful skill for team leaders to learn, so that because they don't need to carry that for their team members as little as you need to carry it for your coaches. Yeah. What remains your facilitation challenge?
I think my facilitation challenge will probably stay, definitely has been for many years, this whole thing about not being enough and my inner imposter voice. Whenever anyone looks just a little bit dissatisfied, unhappy, confused, my first thought is always, I've done something wrong. And so that sense of not enoughness and exposure at the front, because I'm essentially quite shy, is my challenge. And I have lots of tools and things that I'm working on. So I've got really good at noticing it, leaning in with the other person and asking them questions to help them, and doing that letting go for myself. And I think I would love to not feel, that sinking feeling in my stomach, and that sort of, I don't know, hollowing in my chest and my pulse quickening. But maybe that's just going to be a part of my empathetic understanding that something is happening within the group that I need to lean into. And it's just that continual working on the fact that actually that's a great thing that I've spotted it, and to embrace it, and not to internalize it as, oh my God, this isn't perfect. Look, there's a kerfuffle.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And I love how you are able to recognize the sensations in your body. And which makes me wonder. So I read this book called Emotional, and I'm incapable to remember the name of the author. It's amazing. And he reminds that basically emotions are the interpretation of body sensations in our brain.
Yeah.
So it triggers an action. We feel something, our brain says, oh, do this. As I heard you explaining, I was just feeling how much you care. So all of this, the increased heart rate, the chest, you say something, you have the impression that someone is judging you or not getting it. And I wonder whether it's possible for us to actually, the moment we have the superpower to really feel it in terms of body, to reframe it or rename it to say, oh, I realized that I really care. Instead of, I'm not good enough.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, that's emotional intelligence, isn't it? To be able to sense it.
And to name it, to know what it is.
Yeah.
Because I think I used to be a smoker for as long as I can think. I'm 42 now. I started with 13. So at the moment, I am a smoker who doesn't smoke. It's like a dry alcoholic. And I think smoking is perfect. So whenever I felt, and it's only now that I realize that whenever I felt uncomfortable body sensations, as you described them, I didn't really feel them. I would have a smoke. And then I don't feel them at all. And off they go. And I think we have grabbing the phone, doing all these kind of numbing activities, just not to feel. And that's why I felt very touched when you said, I wish I didn't have to feel all of these sensations. And actually, I think it's so beautiful that you can feel them, that you're not numbing, that you're not.
Yes. Yeah. Not like hid behind a little protective breastplate, I'm not going to feel anything. I'm just going to run through my agenda, tell you all the things, go through the motions, and whatever goes on, I'm not going to feel. Yeah. I think as well, I've gone on a bit of a journey. So I'm in my mid-50s, and when emotional intelligence first came out, I was first in stepping into leadership. So it was many decades ago. And as a leadership team, we all did the emotional intelligence test, and 2 leaders from the group got very, very poor, very low scores for emotional intelligence. And one of them was the IT director, which everybody thought, yes, of course, technical director. And the other one was the head of customer experience, which was very surprising because customer experience is very touchy-feely. And that was me. And so what I love is that I've learned how to be empathetic. I've learned how to communicate effectively with others. I've learned how to go from being a Marmite leader where people either loved me or hated me, which I now know is because I had the people I felt safe with and the people I didn't feel safe with. And the people I didn't feel safe with didn't like me because they got that prickly protective version versus the people that did. And you can learn it, So when I first started running my team, I had my PA, and she would write on the top of the agenda, ask people how they are. That's on the top of the agenda. But my philosophy was, we're here to get things done. Let's get all the things done in the meeting. And if there's time, we can do a chitter chat at the end. But you generally fill the time, don't you? So there was never time for chitter chat. And I found people who were more relational than task driven, very time wastery. Why are they doing all of this stuff? Not getting on with it because we need to do this stuff over here. So and so for me to say I've learned that the agenda is not as important as the conversation is like a total flip. But what I love is that if I've learned it, anyone can. And also because I needed to learn it, I'm able to decode it for other people. Whereas I think if something is a natural ability, it's just what I do. It's just what you do. Why are you just being so strange? Whereas I kind of was there. I was the person who had no clue how everyone else is feeling or what my impact was. Had my kind of head down, not acknowledging emotions because clearly that would just be so painful because that would be about me and my inadequacies and just going through, a bit like a snowplow through everything. Whereas now I'm able to sit within the experience and feel feelings and know that that's helpful because that means this person has a question. This needs to be explored. We need to spend a bit more time here. So it's been, a beautiful journey. And I think in that spiral, I've kind of gone, a long way from where I started.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that we got to that. And thank you so much for sharing it. And for, sharing your story that the leader with the low EQ was you. And look where you are now.
Yeah. I mean, with cognitive bias, the head of HR was like, Amanda, I don't think you understood this quiz. And I was like, I did understand it. I just couldn't do it. It was too hard.
And the insight you just called yourself the Marmite leader. Some liked you, some didn't, because there were some you felt comfortable with and others you didn't. And I think what we often forget is to see this in the leaders. It's so easy to judge the micromanager and the overly emotional leader and the screaming manager and all of those. But yeah, they're humans.
They are humans.
Who try to protect their own insecurities.
Yeah.
And how to break that open.
Yeah. Yeah, because you're seeing survival strategies.
Yeah.
So you're seeing people under threat and how they behave when they're under threat in order to feel safe.
And then the importance actually for leaders to learn all these skills. I mean, what a pity that you're no longer, with everything you know now and your EQ and all the people skills, what a shame that you're not leading a department anymore.
But then I think,
not for you, but for your team leader.
Yeah, I get to work with multiple leaders who work with multiple departments. So I'm just trying to do maths in my head and think, for all the people I'm working with, how many thousands of people are they impacting? Which would be, I think, more than I would do as a single leader. And I like to share what I know with that generosity and spark that curiosity and sense of empowerment, so everybody can feel they can do it. Because quite often people say, I'm not a people person, or I'm not a touchy-feely person, or I could never do that. And often for a lot of technical leaders, they forego developing their career and they feel like they're stuck just in that kind of, all I can ever be is like a lead technical specialist because I'm not good with people. And my argument would be, well, you've never learned, you've never been taught. And actually with the right framing and understanding, there's so much talent, I think, in people that are dismissed.
And that's the entire story of the fixed versus the growth mindset, right? Do we judge ourselves by how we've been in the past, or do we see opportunities in how we could be in the future?
Yeah.
And it's shocking, I think, how many highly intelligent people are stuck in a fixed mindset. With all this body of experience and knowledge, what is it that you would have wished you had known before?
Ooh, I think I had to reflect on this, and it was like, oh gosh, there's so many things. It might be about the power of questions and sparking understanding in others, because I think I spent a lot of time building up my expertise and feeling like I didn't know enough. I didn't know enough. When I know more, then it'll be okay. Whereas actually asking those questions is better than, reading a gazillion books. And I've recently done some training called the Inner Success Program, and it's about eliminating imposter syndrome for good. And so the first time I heard about imposter syndrome, I was training as a coach, and I was told, well, this is for 70% of high achieving individuals. And so I dismissed it all because I thought, well, I'm not high achieving, so that's not relevant for me. So I kind of joke that, I had imposter syndrome about having imposter syndrome.
That's very meta.
But I think if I'd have leaned into that and let go of some of that discomfort and been a bit more open, because I felt so much shame about how I felt about myself and my capability, I just think that would have been so liberating. If I'd have had my 30-year-old body with my 55-year-old brain in it, I'd be like an unstoppable thing. But there are exercises and things that you can do to completely rewire and transform your thinking, so you let go of that sense that your worth is conditional. So I think it's very, you talked about meditation, and I do think there is something about when you fully appreciate that you're worthy of love and you are enough just as you are, and so is everyone else, it transforms your relationship with you, it transforms your relationship with how you are with others, and you let go of so much noise in your head that you don't need. And I think, that would be the gift that I would like to have given to my younger self. And, if you could pass out that gift across the universe, what a transformed world it would be.
Amen. Yeah, thank you.
You're most welcome. It's been a lovely and slightly emotional conversation, but no, it's been beautiful. I'm just so grateful to have been invited. It's been a delight.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing and for being so open about your own transformation. I think it's really inspiring.
My pleasure.
Thank you for staying tuned and for listening until the very end. I hope that you found the inspiration and the wisdom that you are looking for. And I hope that you will subscribe to the show so that you never miss any of the interviews with another inspiring facilitator from across the world. I'm devoted to continue this podcast and to deliver weekly an episode that maintains the quality that you expect and you deserve. And if you would like to help me to maintain this quality and to keep the podcast free, please help us. Visit workshops.work/support to make a small donation to keep the podcast free. Thank you so much. I hope to be in your ears next week.